disruptive.
America that I fought for.
Weird thing to happen. Hello, one and all. Welcome to this edition of Kitz Corner. Hope you're having a fantastic day so far. So, Tucker Carlson, fresh back from his trip in Moscow, interviewing Vladimir Putin, which people are calling the biggest traitor known to mankind for doing the act of journalism, has had an epiphany while in Moscow. Because an American going to Russia and seeing Russia for what it actually is and not just spewing the propaganda that MSNBC tells us what Russia is an eye-opening experience. It's eye-opening to see what actually countries and cities and towns that we're told how they operate and what it actually is when you see it in person. And Tucker Carlson said this on stage at a summit event, and he had this kind of miraculous, eye-opening, kind of moving experience being in Moscow. And he's about to say this as an American journalist, touring through Moscow, seeing how, the city is and seeing how the Russian economy and how their governance work and how civilians and society works in Russia. And it's vastly different than what mainstream media is telling you. And here's Tucker Carlson explaining this in detail at this summit event. And listen to this.
Comparing the culture, the competence between Vladimir Putin and Biden, how do you see the two men now running the world?
I mean, if this were boxing, the fight would be called by the medic. And I say that as an American, and I don't have another passport. I don't plan to ever leave my country. My family's been there hundreds of years, and I love it. I am a patriotic American. And I grieve when I see that the president is non compos menis, and that in my country, it is considered very rude to say that. And you sort of wonder, how did you get to a place where you have an incompetent president who's driven not simply the standard of living, but life expectancy downward, and no one feels free to say that? That's not a political observation. It's a statement of fact, which is provable empirically. And the most radicalizing thing I would just say for me in the 8 days I spent in Moscow was not simply the leader of the country, who of course is impressive. It's the largest landmass in the world. And it's wildly diverse, linguistically, culturally, religiously. It's hard to run a country like that for 24 years, whether you like it or not. So an incapable person couldn't do that. He is very capable, and many of you know him, and you know that. What was radicalizing, very shocking and very disturbing for me was the city of Moscow, where I'd never been, the biggest city in Europe, 13 million people. And it is so much nicer than any city in my country. I had no idea. My father spent a lot of time there in the 80s when he worked for the US government and barely had electricity. And now it is so much cleaner and safer and prettier aesthetically. Its architecture, its food, its service, than any country, city in the United States that you have to, and this is non-ideological. How did that happen? How did that happen? And at a certain point, I don't think the average person cares as much about abstractions as about the concrete reality of his life. And if you can't use your subway, for example, as many people are afraid to in New York City because it's too dangerous, you have to sort of wonder, isn't that the ultimate measure of leadership? And that's true, by the way. It's radicalizing for an American to go to Moscow. I didn't know that, I've learned it this week. To Singapore, to Tokyo, to Dubai and Abu Dhabi. Because these cities, no matter how we're told they're run and on what principles they're run, are wonderful places to live that don't have rampant inflation, where you're not going to get raped.
Sir, excuse me.
What is that?
Excuse me. Are you anti-American model?
No. I am the most pro-American. So I'm 54. I was born in 1969. I grew up in a country that had cities like Moscow and Abu Dhabi and Dubai and Singapore and Tokyo. And we no longer have them. And what I have discovered is that's a voluntary choice. As inflation is, as you heard in that fascinating last panel, inflation is the product of choices made mostly by the central bank, not exclusively, but by policymakers. Crime, same. You don't have to have crime, actually. If you don't my children don't smoke marijuana at the breakfast table. Why? Because I won't allow them. It's very simple. It's a short conversation. No. And you can run your country the same way. We're not going to put up with that, so don't do it. And people understand that. Filth, graffiti, Paris, one of my favorite cities, New York, one of my favorite cities, are filthy. And part of the reason they're filthy is because people spray paint obscenities on buildings and no one cleans it up. So that encourages more people to do the same. And our policymakers, for some reason, don't notice this. London, another one of my favorite cities. You see English girls begging for drugs on the sidewalk. And I thought to myself, if I'm Boris Johnson, who briefly and very badly ran that country, I would ask myself, like, wait a second, my countrymen are begging for drugs on the street. Maybe I should do something about that. But no, he'll show up and give some speech about Ukraine and how we need to send, more cluster bombs to the brave Ukrainians. What are you doing?
That's a pretty powerful speech. Like, that is, and what Tucker Carlson's doing there as an American and as a pro-American patriot, because I don't see Tucker Carlson, packing his bags and moving his family to another town or city or country and starting anew. Like, Tucker Carlson views America as his home, and when he travels around, when you see all these different places, it gives you that ability to judge and determine, maybe something's wrong with our structure, because when you go to Russia or when you go to Singapore and you see how clean, you see how, tolerant these people are, you see, the mass amount of architectural design and infrastructure and how beautiful the landscapes are. Why aren't we learning from that? Why are we not taking advantage of other countries around the world and learning from different nations on how to better ourselves so that we can become more successful, more ready to compete with other nations? I thought that was kind of the point. So it's amazing that Tucker Carlson is making this revelation. Of course, somewhere out there, CNN, MSNBC are like scrounging this and scrubbing every detail of this video to try to point this as some sort of, Vladimir Putin talking point, and Tucker Carlson's, bringing the Russian Kool-Aid to signal out, how great Moscow is. But look at how great, LA is with all the tent cities there are around. Can't you say something nice about Gavin Newsom? Can't you say something nice about Eric Adams, the former cop that has now turned New York City over its head? Can't you say no, you gotta talk about Moscow? Like, I'm just hearing the mainstream media trying to clip this and bait this for their own stupid propagandist coverage. But it is just an amazing speech. And you know what? This actually kind of reminds me of, and I still watch reruns to this day. Probably the only CNN produced show that I could watch from start to finish and actually enjoy it is Anthony Bourdain's No Reservations, or what was the other one they did? Whatever the Anthony Bourdain show was. He travels around, he goes to different places, he eats food, and he talks to people. It seems like, the simple, generic show, and it seems like there's no point and no action or no conflict, and you feel like that's kind of boring. When you actually watch a show like that, when you watch, like, travel shows, and you see people interacting with other cultures and seeing how they live, it is kind of fascinating. It's kind of fascinating to see uphand how these countries actually operate, to see firsthand, a live eye view of, Iran, for example. I was always told Iran was this, terrorist haven, kind of cultivizing, and there's terrorists in every corner, and they're wearing hijabs, and they're just evil, and they have no respect for anybody, including their women. You hear that all the time through the mainstream media. But then you watch Anthony Bourdain going to Iran, and you realize, oh my God, Iran's actually a decent country. Iran is similar to our standards. They have teenagers that play video games over there. They have young kids that are playing soccer in the driveway there. They have parents that go to work. They have, cars. They have Ford and Toyotas there. Like, what exactly am I supposed to feel scared at this point when you see uphand these countries? Same with Moscow. Same with all these other nations. And I feel like that's something that more people should experience, more people should endure. And I recommend more people watch those travel shows so you better understand geographically, or if you have the ability to, if you're fortunate enough to do so, travel some more. Go see these different territories and not get sucked into the drone of the mainstream media, because the mainstream media is always going to try and paint this picture as America's the best and everywhere else is crap. But that's not true. That's not always true. And they're doing that purposely to, again, manipulate you to think that Russia is this dictatorship and they just hate gay people, when Moscow actually has a lot of gay bars, which I didn't even know at the time. But they do that because Vladimir Putin is not on the side of the extreme LGBTQ agenda of the transgender movement and gender affirming surgery for children. Like, he's not on board with that, but he's tolerant to gay people. He's tolerant to all different backgrounds and sexualities and credences. You know, that's what makes Moscow this vitriol of a city. It's like all these other places. So it's amazing. It's amazing that it took Tucker Carlson to go to Moscow, interview Vladimir Putin, get all this smack from the mainstream media, and then for him to go on stage and say, as an American, I feel like rejuvenated about the world. I was told the world is a scary place and, you know, everyone hates us because they hate our freedoms. But actually, the world is actually an interesting place and more people should get out and explore. You know, if we actually talk to one another and find out about different people, then maybe we actually become more tolerant. Crazy idea, crazy thought. It's amazing. It's amazing. Tucker Carlson having an epiphany moment, and like I said, I'm sure mainstream media is gonna scoop this up and try to make as many sound bites as possible. Again, bash him for the simple act of journalism, and again, why. The reason why they're going after Tucker Carlson is not because he's some stooge for any country. It's because he is a curious person who wants to find true information and provide details and facts to you, that you, the viewer, that are watching Tucker Carlson and seeing his interviews, get the full perspective, get the full story. And we're not getting told the full story because they don't want us to know the full story, because if you know the full story, then maybe you start getting critical of what they're saying. You start to get critical of what you've been told your entire life, that you've been manipulated ever since the start of these wars, ever since the start of COVID, ever since the start of any of these things. It's always good to have more knowledge. It's always good to have more information out there. And that is what Tucker Carlson and many other people are just trying to do. Just provide context to you. Take it as you will. You don't have to agree with it, but it's always good to know that there is more information out there.